The following program is part 2 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
Okay, why don't we move on then, if I could get the lights, and we'll go on to another sort of subject area. I want to mention a couple of sort of newer things, if you will, and you'll probably hear about these. And the reason I want to mention them is that they are sort of getting out into what we're calling natural products, if you will. And this is a good and poor example, but it also is going to sort of open up the subject. Metam is a product, a chemical that was actually on the homeowner market under the trade name Vapam at one time. It's an extremely good pre-plant fumigant, and it's a liquid and it will control a broad spectrum, but we no longer have it available for the homeowner, but we are using it in commercial fields. One of the things we've been interested in is the potential for using acetic acid. Now, probably most of you know acetic acid. I assume you use it probably, well, I'd guess about 5 days a week.
Vinegar.
Right, vinegar. Vinegar is normally 5% acetic acid in concentration. Now, you can make acetic acid any concentration by starting off with glacial acetic acid, which is 99.7% pure, and then cut it with water if you want. But we are actually looking at acetic acid as a pesticide. Now, it will control weeds post-emergence by just spraying it on weeds when it's hot. You literally burn green tissue. Now, you can do that also with hot water or steam. Now, I won't recommend this, and please don't do it either, and I'm kidding. Gasoline does a real good job, too. I'm kidding. Do not do that. But anyway, the thought was that we might be able to use acetic acid as a pesticide, and in this case, I'm comparing it with some of the fumigants like Metam, and these would be the amount of actually how much it costs to weed an area, which gives us a measure of how many weeds were present. So Metam plus tarp for 6 weeks cost us $15. Acetic acid plus tarp for 6 weeks, $25. So what it's saying is that acetic acid under a tarp, and this is not 5%, this is half rate vinegar. This is 2.5%. Now this is not some, and I'm bringing this up and I'm doing it also for another reason. When you hear a presentation like this, you can probably say, well, first thing, don't believe it, but secondly, don't recommend it to someone who calls to you. So you see this wonderful result, right? So tomorrow when you're on the phone, or next week when well, tomorrow's Saturday, you won't be on the phone. Next week when you're on the phone at the desk, and you say, somebody calls to you and say, you know, I heard someone talking about using vinegar as a herbicide. What do you know about it? Can I use it? And I heard that. Dr. Elmore, he came the other day and he said, well, by using it under tarp for 6 weeks, gave wonderful control. Use it. Wrong. Don't do it. The reason I'm doing this, one, it does work. We are continuing to research this. It is researching. It's not something we can currently recommend. It's in no university publication. And that's our source, right? As a master gardener, that's our source. Our source is also not Ortho Problem Solver books or Sunset. I mean, they're great references, but they're not something that we can recommend or suggest that the homeowner look for. But this probably will eventually get into our books. In fact, my guess is I will write a pest note on this, so it will be something that we can use. But the other part of that, of course, is there is no label for this anywhere. So I can't recommend it because there isn't a label. Now, if I can find a company that would be willing to write the label and register that compound as a herbicide, then we can say, homeowner, yes, this looks good in the results that I've heard about. It's in our pest note. Why don't you try it? At least consider it as one of the possibilities when you consider ways of controlling your pests. So I'm doing it for more than one reason. One is sort of alert you that this probably will come out in a pest note and that we will probably have it available for use. There is a recommended or a registered material out there now, which is a combination of acetic acid and citric acid as a post-emergent spray, but not as this. This is a drench. And unless they rewrite the label, we still couldn't suggest that someone try this. Yes?
Is that a mistake? Can you explain why when you combine the acetic acid with the tarp, it costs more than the tarp alone?
No, it actually costs less to weed. This is acetic acid applied without a tarp, and it costs this amount to weed, which means lots more weeds.
Drop down.
Okay.
The tarps to the acetic acid plus tarp.
Yeah, okay. Let me explain this. What this is actually, if the letter behind here is the same, they're not different, statistically at least. 95 out of 100 times they will not be different. So basically what it's saying, because of this statistics over here, it's saying that there's no difference between those. So if I went out and did this 100 times, roughly, they would be 95 times they would be the same, but not always. So in theory, there's probably no difference between those. That's statistical error. It would appear, at least, to a person who is not involved in statistics, that they are definitely different. And in some cases, they may be. But when you're running experiments like this, why you do analyze them statistically, and basically they would not be different. The other thing that is interesting, however, and you do bring up a point, is that the tarp for 6 weeks is basically no different than this, but better than that. So one might ask, really, why add the acetic acid when your tarp does the same thing? So that's probably what you were asking, and I didn't pick up on it. So why do I put a whole bunch of acetic acid out? Well, the reason we did it here, and it's actually another part of the test, is that we had nutsedge in it, and I was after nutsedge control. Nutsedge was not figured into the weeding cost. See, I don't tell you the whole story either. But for yellow nutsedge, which is very, very difficult to control, we have found that by using acetic acid, if we can get it to the nutlet, we can kill it, which is very unusual. And so we're definitely continuing to try to see if we can control some of the perennial forms, because they either have nutlets or other propagules that we may be able to control with acetic acid. But, and again, we can make another point from this is, just because somebody shows you a whole bunch of glorious numbers and data, what does it mean? So, I think you're doing a good service by being critical of what we're seeing up here too, yes.
What's happened to the pH?
What happens to the pH? This was put on for 1 week. The plastic was pulled off and the pH of the soil was measured. At 1 week, our normal pH would be 7. Where we've put the 2.5% acetic acid, it dropped to 5.6% pH. However, 2 weeks later, it was 6.9 and 7. So the soil is a tremendously buffered area, and acetic acid degradation is quite rapid, so therefore it regained its pH very quickly. We actually, 2 weeks after we pulled the plastic off, we planted transplants of Godesia, Godesia, snapdragon, and column stalk, and there was no effect at any rate of acetic acid we used. So, the degradation is enough that within a very short time we can plant, and had no effect on the plants. Yes?
Cost aside, if someone's putting in a new landscape in barren ground, and their landscaper recommends VAPAM treatment.
Don't. He cannot do that.
Well, the landscaper,
He cannot do that.
okay, can he,
It's not a legal application.
that must have just happened very recently.
Well, he's not following all the rules. Not if it's in a homeowner situation.
Homeowner situation and
No.
moving around and
No, I would
taped off with skull and crossbones and,
I would challenge that. No, I think he's bending the rules on a homeowner situation.
What's he applying?
Metham or VAPAM. Yeah, there are regulations on close proximity to houses. Yeah. This is also, of course, being confronted in agriculture because of fields being close to houses. Yeah. I mean, it's a very effective treatment, and from what we know of the material, it would be safe to do, but the law doesn't allow it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, this is basically some of the same type of thing for field bindweed, and I basically like to show you the solarized versus non-solarized for field bindweed control. And again, I kind of want to point out that, question the numbers you get when you see quote data. These data are outstanding, but I haven't told you when the measurement was taken. And I'm doing this actually because I'll bring up something a little bit later that'll sort of, again, emphasize the point. If I pull the plastic off after treatment with solarization and evaluate it 2 weeks later, this would be the data that I would get. If I evaluated it 5 weeks later, this would not be any different whatsoever. They would be exactly the same. Because what we do with solarization, we burn the top off and we burn the bindweed slightly into the soil, and it takes about 3 weeks for it to regrow. But all of these underground rhizomes down here eventually regrow, and it becomes no effect. So when you see all kinds of data like this, really question sometimes where it's coming from, and a lot of people don't give you all the facts. Solarization will work on virtually every winter annual. Burr clover is probably the exception. It's not 100%, but virtually every winter annual. You don't need to copy all that down. It's in this book, and if you think of winter annuals, all of them are controlled. So it's not that we need to know, we probably need to know which are winter annuals or not. As far as summer annuals, most of them will be controlled as well. Not all of them. One I put down here at the bottom is purslane, common purslane, which it's sort of the test of whether solarization works. If you get good solarization, it gives 100% control of purslane. If the solarization is only moderately good, you may lose 50% control. But virtually all of these others up here really are controlled quite well with solarization. Okay, these are the limitations. I've already talked about this a little bit, and we've talked about this disposal, injury to beneficial organisms. Basically, these are certain soil fungi, and particularly mycorrhizal fungi. They do depress the population for a period of time, and then it actually comes back. But again, this is pretty much in this book. We do need good soil preparation. It needs to be basically ready to plant, and because once we pull the plastic off, you can plant immediately. It actually is a very good seed bed to plant into. This is field bindweed, the plant outside the solarized area. This is where the edge of the plastic actually went up over a bed, and it was growing right along the edge, and that was actually under the plastic. And then on back behind it was 6 feet of bed itself, and that was totally clear of bindweed when we pull the plastic off. So it looks beautiful at that point. This is the nutsedge you were asking about. Right on the edge of the plastic, you can see some effect of the plastic on the nutsedge, but right outside, and often this literally punctures through plastic. And when the leaves come up and touches a very tight part of the plastic, it literally punctures through 4 or 5 mil plastic. And that's a characteristic of the sedges. Many of the other plants won't do that. Okay, mechanical control. I love to use this shot. This is my favorite way of controlling ivy. That happened to be English ivy, and that was my front yard at one house several years ago. And basically there were 2 of us. One would basically roll it, the other would cut out the root as we went, and I got probably 99.8% or whatever control. Never used a herbicide. In fact, if you spray Roundup, it doesn't work anyway. It's very, very poor control. So you have to get rid of the biomass some way, so why not take it off initially? And then you can run it through a chipper and, you know, compost, whatever. Different other mechanical methods. This is one of the greatest exercise tools pawned on man. It does not control dandelion very well, even though it's called a dandelion knife. It does control many of the annual broadleaves, like this common sow thistle right here. But if you have a perennial like dandelion or curly dock or some of the ones that have very thick, deep tap roots, then often what happens, you cut off a piece of it, and those are inch segments, by the way, and if you put those little inch segments back on sand, every one of them grows. So what you're doing is you're cutting that taproot off, and then the leaf bases will come out of the cut hole, come out on the top, and you've got the dandelion then a very short time later. If the root is less than pencil size, and you go about 3 inches in the soil, you will control it. But otherwise, dandelion tends to regrow from this type of an implement. You have all kinds of hoes. I mentioned that we have often a favorite hoe. These shuffle hoes tend to be fairly good on hard soil. They're kind of hard to work with. They do take some energy, however, in the sense that grasses often are cut off above ground and therefore they regrow, but many of the broadleaves can be controlled easily. Another type of an implement, this happens to be Bermuda grass, and if any of that goes back on the moist soil, you've just propagated it. So any one of those little segments will form a new plant. So what she's doing really is beating it up. If it stays out where it can dry, of course, then it will kill the top, but it doesn't kill the root. This is a flamer, propane bottle. You see any problem with this? You probably couldn't get a permit for that, could you? It's a great demonstration shot, how not to do it. The thought is, though, this is velvet leaf, which is a fairly tough plant to control. However, with flame, just a very once over lightly does quite a good job. It doesn't take, even at this size plant, it's not too difficult. The thing we have to remember, though, because of the characteristic of a plant, broadleaves, again, will be much more easily controlled than grasses. Because, again, the growing point of the broadleaf is right up at the top, and it's easy to control, whereas the grass is right at the soil line, and it's going to regrow, just like when we mow a grass. So it becomes a selective treatment, and if you were to use this for a long period of time, you would shift the population, or the species, from a broadleaf population to a grass population. It's a wonderful world of plants. Okay, biological control. Biological control we normally think of in the classic situation of insects. And I mentioned this Klamath weed beetle earlier. This happens to be one of the beetles that has been released for yellow star thistle control. And we'd love to make this work. But all of the ones that have been released and have actually colonized at this point are seed feeders. They actually feed on the seed of star thistle. The best they can do so far is about 50% reduction of seed, which means if the plant produces 20,000 seeds per plant, that means only 10,000 seeds per plant left. Well, it's progress, I guess, but it's usually enough to carry the population. So under the current situation with biocontrol, it's not effective on this situation. So what they've got to do, or we've got to do, whoever, is to find additional different type of feeding habits or introduce another organism to either go and bore into stems or eat or bore into roots. Do something besides the seed part to bring that population down further. And there's a lot of work going on, and my guess is eventually they'll find something that will decrease our star thistle population. This happens to be one leaf miner that's used on purslane. And though they totally, well, almost totally defoliate purslane in the summer, it will regrow and seed. So it's again, it's not necessarily a viable biocontrol method for purslane control. Another point that needs to be made with weeds, in your garden, how many different species do you have? I'm sorry? Weeds. Weeds. How many different weed species do you have? 10 or 20, right. So biological control, remember, is highly specific. It works on one species. Now if, as an example, you only had 10 species in your garden and you were able to control one with biological control, would it really be worthwhile? Yes and no. Maybe, you know, if the overall weeding time probably doesn't mean anything at all. It does mean something if you have a specific weed, however, like star thistle, that we would like to reduce. So if you have something that's highly specific, then biological control of weeds can be very beneficial. Yes?
There's also another thing, going back to your climate weed example, there's a situation where once in a while they'll go after slightly different species.
Yes. That's a very good point. Her comment was, going back to my Klamath weed beetle situation for biological control, we have a food predator combination here. What happens when all the food is gone? If they're not totally specific, they won't die out. They tend to move on to something less palatable. In other words, the ornamental hypericum, or hypericums, there's more than one, that when the Klamath weed food population is low, they will tend to move over and feed on the ornamentals. They tend not to be a major problem. They don't look real good, but there are some, you don't like that. there is some feeding if the weed populations are low. That one actually is more specific than some of the others, and there's really quite a controversy going on biological control with insects, and more so even with pathogens right now, because we are introducing, biological control researchers are actually bringing in a lot of organisms which may not be evaluated in all the species we have. And if there was almost one pathogen released on a member of the aster family, and they had screened lots and lots of plants, it looked to be highly effective, it controlled star thistle, and they were almost ready to release it, and someone said, well, what about commercial safflower? We don't grow safflower back here. Well, they sure do XYZ places. Well, I guess we better screen it. It just cleaned it out. So that one went down the tubes. It's something they could not release. So it has to be highly specific, and if it does move, they have to be aware of what it's going to move on and what effect it will have. But there's a lot of concern, really, that some of these organisms should not have been brought in, or should not be brought in, because they do tend to become somewhat less specific. Or, in fact, the picture that I showed you on star thistle, that was not the intended identified organism that was brought in for release. It was actually an unidentified organism that came in with the shipment that has been the most successful. So can you believe science? It has to be a question that's asked on something like that one, because, what's that?
Speaking of the golf fly?
Yeah. Yeah, so it was not the intended introduction, but so far it has been fine. It has not created a problem. This is this is not biocontrol. I use it because often we see insect feeding. This happens to be aphid on South Thistle. Some insects are highly specific to a plant, and in this particular case, they pretty much feed only on South Thistle. So you do have, in this case, a food source for certain biological organisms for other control, such as ladybird beetles. You know, it's not a weed control technique, but if we grow an insect on one of our weeds that will feed a beneficial organism for insect control, that can be beneficial also. So it's just another piece of the whole puzzle. We have other things besides insects, of course, or pathogens as biocontrol. We've already talked about goats earlier on poison oak. These are weeder geese, and they are literally very, very efficient for eating certain weeds. This happens to be a fig orchard down in the San Joaquin Valley, but we do use sheep, use livestock. In fact, you're going to hear more about livestock grazing. When grazing has been removed from certain park areas, the invasive plants have just gone crazy. Parts of Montana and Wyoming, this was discussed at this meeting the first part of this week, that grazing is a very beneficial part of that ecosystem. And when they pull them off and ban grazing due to livestock, their weed problems have just mushroomed, because the cattle have actually been very beneficial in keeping it down. Here's a goat picture, if you will. They tend to be very efficient. They'll eat most anything. Plant-wise, it's a matter of stocking rate and taking care of them. And when I say take care of them, you do have to protect them. There are certain two-legged predators that tend to pick them up once in a while, and they end up on a table. But so you also have to, of course, either protect them and also make sure they have water and things like that. So it is a process or something that can be used for biocontrol. Let me change the tray if we could. And I guess I'm going to make a statement about biological control for the home landscape. And most people don't want to hear this, but quite frankly, it is not a viable mechanism of control. And virtually any weed control situation that we have in the landscape. It is going to work well in, or has the potential of working well, greatest potential, in large non-cropped areas like forestry, rangeland, road edges, things of that sort, that's not really disturbed. As soon as we start disturbing some of these organisms, they don't work well. They don't like it. As an example, puncture vine is a fairly common weed in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley. If we don't disturb the site, such as road edges, there have been two beetles, a stem beetle and a seed beetle, that is really quite effective of keeping the population down. But once it's in an orchard or a cultivated field, the population mushrooms because the insects won't move into that site. And so therefore, seed production from those sites are actually quite high. So our disturbance can be quite a detriment to certain biological organisms. Okay, the last area that I want to talk about, and there's two or three things about chemicals, I guess, that I should start with. One is that whether they're synthesized or natural, they can all be poisonous. And the reason that we actually use herbicides is to kill plants or to suppress them. That's the only reason we do it. So if you put a chemical such as water on a plant at 100 gallons per acre, which could be a sprayable rate, and it doesn't get into the plant, move to some site and affect the plant to kill it or suppress its growth, it's not a herbicide. Now, if I raise the gallonage of water to, say, well, I have to give you sort of a hypothetical here, because 1 acre inch of water is 27,174 gallons. So if I took that times 10, that'd be 10 acre inches of water. That might smother a plant. We could use it as basically as a herbicide by putting 10 inches of water. So flooding, if you will. You could use flooding as a weed control technique. Now, those are not synthesized products. What happens usually when you synthesize a chemical is that you take something of known activity so that it affects some plant bio or physiological system, such as photosynthesis. Now, you and I don't photosynthesize very well. I mean, we can do other things together, but we can't photosynthesize very well. We aren't green. So plant scientists or biochemists have decided that photosynthesis would be a system that they would develop chemicals to try to interrupt, and therefore you end up with a herbicide. The same can be true with amino acid synthesis. We don't synthesize amino acids. We break them down. We don't synthesize them. Only plants can synthesize them. So if we find a chemical that some way interferes with the passage from glycine, for example, to tyrosine or phenylalanine as amino acids, then it becomes a herbicide, and therefore it becomes effective in blocking certain systems. And that's where a lot of the chemicals actually come from. Now, in so doing, we often can reduce dramatically the amount that's required. Instead of 10 acre inches of water to flood, we're now down at a point of using a quarter of a pound per acre. When you think about that, it's really very, very small quantity. In fact, we're even lower than that. We're down to about 2 ounces per acre. And just the literal distribution of that such small quantity has become very difficult anymore, because almost at that point you're talking about molecules, not pounds but molecules. So you're looking at very, very small quantities. Now, in a situation like this, the primary reason, of course, is to grow some sort of a cover in between the vine rows so that we don't have erosion. We actually can plant a cover crop to garner some nitrogen, possibly, not necessarily in grapes. But in between, then, we try to keep the vegetation out so it's not competing and allows the grapevines to grow as best as they can. Now, depending upon what your desire may be, in certain vineyards here in the valley floor, they are too vigorous. They have too much vine growth, and therefore fruit quality isn't very good, which means that the wine quality isn't very good. So now we're back to, I mean, this is easy for me to do now. Now we're back to, well, can we push this in and reduce the vine growth or compete with the vine at a certain time of year to improve fruit quality and yield but decrease vine growth? So we're even trying to manipulate vegetation even more than just trying to keep competition out. But this is a fairly common practice, say, in agriculture. We don't do as much of this, of course, around the home. People tend not to go as extreme as this because, one, you don't have this large vineyard to work with. You have 5 rows of corn and 1 row of carrots and 2 plants of cucumber and 5 of cantaloupe, and you don't use herbicides there. It's just not part of the vegetable garden. Yeah.
But in a home orchard situation where you may have a dozen or so.
That's fine. That's fine.
What's one?
To use herbicides, yes, to use herbicides.
Is mulching?
Mulching is a possibility as well. And maybe, I guess, at this point is, and I've...
Otherwise, you're always fighting weeds.
Yes, you're always fighting weeds with mulches, too. You keep have to add them, or you have to shift them, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so really what we're really looking at is all of these different methods, sort of putting them together. I'm definitely not an advocate of using just herbicides. I mean, I know a lot about herbicides, I've worked with them, but I'm not also a total advocate of mulching, because I've killed plants with mulches. I mean, not the synthetics, but I've actually killed it with yard waste. And snapdragons, with 3 inches of yard waste in a trial that I had in Santa Clara, I killed 50% of the plants. And when I take it to a plant pathologist, they said, yeah, you had them too close to the stem, you've got disease moving across, and we killed the snapdragons. So there's pluses and minuses with, you know, each one of these. But our hope is then of trying to put it together so that we basically have a system to reduce weed populations. Yeah. Yes?
In this picture, did they use a selective herbicide like narrow leaf herbicide for under the vine?
Yes, and that's a very good point. Basically what happens, and it depends upon how a person wants to farm. In this particular case, they would apply a pre-emergence selective herbicide in the fall of the year before the first rain. By doing that, they do not have to have a post-emergence herbicide with it. So they only limited it to one chemical. Now, if the weeds were growing like this, as an example, you wanted to come in and for some reason control the weeds there, you would have to use a post-emergence herbicide to kill the weeds that are already growing. If you wanted, you could put a post-emergence herbicide with a pre-emergence herbicide and leave the pre-emergence behind to control any other germinating weeds as well.
You'd also have a hazard problem with your vines if you put a post-emergence herbicide next to the trunks of the vine, even though they're brown.
Okay, the comment was that you might have a problem with a post-emergence herbicide next to the vine even though they're dormant, you're saying?
Well, no, because ordinarily I believe at that age those vines would be pretty well barked up and brown.
Yeah, actually, you know, there are post-emergence herbicides we could spray right up on the vines if we wanted to during this stage, or even during the summer. In fact, glyphosate or Roundup could be used in this type of a situation. Now, if you had, you know, very young vines like first-year planting, or vines that came from pots where the leaves and stems are very low, you would not want to use Roundup at that stage. You would want to have basically a cover of dead tissue, which basically is bark, that will not allow the chemical then to penetrate. Yeah. Okay, let's go through, you know, a couple of other situations. This is in Christmas trees. I should have probably pulled it out, or we could say that this is up in the foothills. But they've used a pre-emergence in here as well. And the comment that you made was a selective herbicide. Most of the materials that we have are what we call selective. That means basically that we'll control either a single group of plants, a family of plants, a single plant out of other plants without injury. Now, without injury is also quantifiable. It's not injurious enough that it really is going to affect the planting, and it actually totally benefits in the long run because of the lack of competition. It doesn't mean that there's no effect necessarily, but that the overriding effect of competition is much greater than any effect we might have from the selective herbicide. So in this case, you know, they may have been trying to control just annual weeds. I think one of you asked about blackberry. If blackberry were present, they could use a post-emergence herbicide in here, such as Roundup or glyphosate, and control blackberry in Christmas tree plantations. So that is feasible also. Okay, when we talk about herbicides, I like to talk about mode of action. In other words, basically that means from the time that a herbicide is applied, what happens to it, and how does it get into the plant, how does it move in the plant, until it gets to some point that it affects the plant and becomes a herbicide. So if I sprayed water over the top of it, it wouldn't do any harm. It may not be taken into the plant. In fact, certain types of chemicals, like a water-soluble chemical, has to have an additive, basically a soap-like material, what's called an adjuvant or surfactant, to help penetrate into the leaf, because the leaf surface usually has waxes and what's called a cuticle on the outside that keeps most water-soluble materials out. So a product like Roundup is a mixture of a common material, glyphosate, but it adds an adjuvant or surfactant to help get it into the leaf. If it doesn't get into the leaf, it's not effective. So they have to add it, and by making Roundup, it is a formulated material then. So they've taken the active ingredient, which is glyphosate, and they add a surfactant to help get the product in. Now there is a disadvantage there in the sense that the adjuvant or surfactant that they use kills fish. So we cannot use Roundup around water. It'll kill, the surfactant part will kill fish. Glyphosate doesn't, but the surfactant does. Since they know that, they then went back to another product and just kept glyphosate by itself, and that does not kill fish. But you have to add a different non-ionic surfactant to get it in. That product's called Rodeo. I'm sorry?
How would you know which one you're buying at Home Depot?
The only one really is sold for the homeowner is a Roundup type. I mean Roundup or other labeled products with a surfactant in it. That's right. So all of those, if people read the label, it says do not use near or in water because it will kill fish. And that is the concern with Roundup, is this surfactant. It will kill fish, but you don't have the other one for the homeowner. Well, the other one's available for forestry and agricultural use around water, because anyone, hopefully in the homeowner area, is not using it around water.
You could use it by adding dishwasher.
Yeah, you could use glyphosate by adding Lux or something. Yes, that's possible. Yes.
Back to your Roundup and the blackberry situation, the conifers are not affected by the Roundup?
That's a good question. Yes, actually conifers are really quite tolerant to Roundup, except during one period of their lifespan, of their cycle, and that's when new growth is coming out. If you have active new growth and you were to spray it at that time, it will kill that new growth, but you will not kill the tree. And most of the time in a Christmas tree plantation, you tend to prune them up slightly so you still could spray around the skirts. In forestry, of course, they don't care. They just definitely don't spray it over the top. If you allow the plant to go dormant so that you do not have, or you have hardened growth, then you could literally spray Roundup right over the top of the tree, and they do it and have no effect on that tree. They have actually aerial sprayed as well, yes. Yes.
Why is there that distinction between commercial and residential? I was thinking of another chemical, Marathon. That's a newer version of Marathon.
Marathon.
It's used for sucking insects, and I know it's used commercially, but not yet available for residential.
Yeah, they're actually, the question was, we may see sort of an agricultural use of a product and not for homeowner use. There can be really several reasons for that. One is it may not be safe enough to use in proximity to lots of people. That is a possibility. It may be that the company doesn't want to take the risk of putting it in a homeowner area. The other is it's going to cost them a lot more money because they're going to have to do additional tests before it ever gets there. In many companies, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I guess, really look at the potential profit from about 3 to 5 crops, that being corn, soybean, cereal grains, and cotton. And if you don't have a product that works on those 5 crops, we'll never see it. I mean, we may research it, but it'll never make it to market. So somewhere it has to fit into those crops, or often anyway, before it ever gets anywhere. And in other cases, you know, it may not be safe enough to use in the home or around the homeowner situation. Or they don't have the data to show that it's safe enough and they're not going to spend the money to produce it. I don't think this is all bad. I'm not saying that homeowners are inherently careless, but I think there's so many of us, though, that don't read the label, and secondarily, we don't understand how to use chemicals.
Or the disposal.
Well, disposal we can take care of, though. I mean, frequently we have a site that we can take them to. But yeah, there's a lot of lack of understanding and just lack of knowledge. I mean, one of the reasons that we're talking here today is you have an interest, but there are a lot of people who don't. All they want is a very quick solution. And that can create some real problems. And if you have a product that's either sort of hyperactive, in fact, in some cases you might ask, why did Roundup ever make it to market? Because it kills so many plants. Well, if it weren't so safe around warm-blooded animals, it would never have made it to that market, because they don't want to take the risk of having to buy plants. But because it is so safe, the demand was so high that they decided to go ahead and do it.
Maybe price point too, I was just
yeah, but you know, if,
price point down in residence.
Yeah, but homeowners going to pay 200 to 1,000 times more anyway. I mean, it's absurd, really. But the amount of cost involved to get it into that small package is going to be higher. I'm not saying it's 200 times higher, but it's definitely going to be higher. The risk is higher, the marketing is higher, you know, all that kind of stuff. But you know, that's the chemical company line too. You know, I fight with them all the time of thinking there's certain products I would like to see a particular use for, but I work primarily with the commercial agriculturalist. And I had 2 or 3 discussions, very pointed discussions the last 3 days trying to get products for our growers that the company says, we don't want to spend the money and we won't take the risks. I said, well, we'll develop the research to show that it may be safe enough. If it is, will you do it? Well, you do the work and then we'll see about it. Yeah. Okay, translocation, you probably have known it as systemic. You may have heard that term. Basically, it means that it moves from one part of a plant to another. Certain chemicals, herbicides, can be taken up through the roots, almost as if it's a nutrient. It's the same time that water comes into the plant. Taken up through the roots, goes through the dead tissue, and we call that apoplastic. From that, it ends up usually concentrating in the leaves, particularly old leaves, and to some lesser extent in the growing point. But it usually accumulates in old leaves, and it tends to be type of product that would affect photosynthesis. So it block the food forming capacity of the plant. So they tend to be much more effective on seedlings, weed seedlings, and tends to have less of an effect on, say, established shrubs or trees. And we can use that sort of system. Conversely, we can put them on leaves, particularly mature leaves, because mature leaves are transporting. In other words, if it's taken into a mature leaf, it's going to go out of the mature leaf to immature leaves, buds, roots, flowers, things like that. And this is where Roundup would work, or glyphosate. You put it on a mature leaf and it moves out of the leaf and you see it in new growth. If you put it on a very young leaf, particularly in the springtime as it's coming out, if you happen to spray a shrub with these little bitty leaves coming out, you may burn those, but it's really not going to affect the plant very much. It has very little effect because it's not getting back into the plant. You don't get it to the roots, so therefore you don't kill the plant. I mean, it doesn't look good initially, but it's not going to kill a plant. There are a few materials, actually we don't even have but one on the market. It's not something we use in the homeowners area, but there will be some that literally moves across both systems. It goes into one, moves across into the other, and it actually rotates in the plant. There are some of those.
Roundup was an example of the first.
No, second.
Second. Oh,
Yeah, see, so we're actually putting it on leaves, and it goes to the roots, the shoots, and the buds, so it's actually following the food source.
What's an example of the,
Of this one, for homeowners, well, one that's very commonly comes to mind is Simazon, or Princept was one that was commonly used.
what's it called?
Princept, it's not for homeowners anymore. They took it off the market, but that's, let me see, one that's commonly used, well, one you see along the roadside is an example. You see all these white plants along the roadside sometimes now? That's one called Solicam, and that's one that goes into the soil, comes up through roots into the plant. Actually, surfland will also be taken up by roots or stems, and then it actually stunts the root, but it goes into the dead tissue also. One of the concerns that we have, of course, is leaching, and there's several components of leaching. We don't want to see any off-site movement, as we call it. If we have a loam to clay loam soil, there's virtually no chance of downward moving of the herbicide so that it either gets to groundwater or into the roots of most plants. Because organic matter actually, or clay particles in the soil, binds the chemical, and it therefore cannot move. Now, this is one of the nice things about the product glyphosate. Once it reaches soil, plants cannot get it. Okay? So by spraying it on old leaves, it's taken in and readily moved. But if you happen to put it in soil, you could plant the next day and the plant couldn't even pick it up. So it's tightly bound onto the soil. Now, it doesn't mean you can't find it chemically. You can, but and it degrades in soil, so it doesn't stay there, but the plants won't pick it up. But any one of these can affect how a chemical might move in the soil. But most of the ones that we are using currently, and particularly ones around the landscape, tend to be very low in water solubility. And they also generally tightly adsorb the soil so that they're not going to move. And that's one of the characteristics, basically, they have to have before they could be used, say, in this type of a site. That's a requirement. To show you, and this is that product, this is Simazon or Princept, it's just used as an example. But we used a fine sandy loam soil, which is a very good soil. We put 3 inches of water. Well, back up. These actually were upright, so this would be the bottom, this would be the top. And we put the herbicide on the top and then put 3 inches of water over the top, or 6 inches or 9 inches and none on that one. So we didn't move the herbicide. So by adding additional water with a certain solubility, this is 37 parts per million in water, with a certain solubility in water, it will move a certain amount. This is roughly 2.5 inches, say, at 3 inches of water. Normally, we would not want this amount of water over the top of it. If we were to put it down and get an irrigation, we'd probably put 1 inch to 2 inches, which would keep us up in this area. Now, if we took a different herbicide, the solubility of this herbicide is actually greater. This is about 75 parts per million. And then we look at 3 different soil types the same way. The sandy loam, which is the one we saw before, you can see that it moved more, this herbicide moved more than the previous one with the same amount of water. This is a Stockton clay loam, more clay, more organic matter also, and then a Staten Island peaty muck, which is basically peat soil, a very high absorbing soil. It didn't move very much here, but it's roughly equivalent to that clay soil. So by adding more organic matter and clay in that soil, then you would have less chance of movement. The person who, one of you were saying, had a problem up north where they couldn't plant anything, somebody wanted to totally, the best way to try to get rid of that would be to go in and add lots of organic matter. Okay, yeah, and there are certain herbicides, if we knew, for example, if it would happen to be that product, the best thing that that person could do is plant 3 corn crops a year. Plant corn as early as they can in the spring, grow it till it gets about this tall, work it into the ground, plant again. The reason for that is this herbicide is taken up by corn and metabolized, so it literally is degrading it in the crop. And so you can really suck it out of the soil and get rid of it by just planting corn. It's a method of doing it. We did this several years ago. The previous herbicide, Simazin, was used in the Concord area around a site. They built this beautiful new building on it and then couldn't get their turf grass to grow. And we went and determined what they had, planted corn around this beautiful new building. It looks silly as the dickens, but 2 corn crops later they could plant. And so basically we just detoxified the soil, if you will, by using corn.
Is corn edible?
The corn is edible, absolutely. Yeah, because it ends up in the leaves as it's degrading, but it doesn't go to the kernels. But we didn't allow it to go that far. We wanted to get lots of foliage and then work it back in and replant. Okay, there's really a couple of concerns that we have with off-site movement. We don't want it, the first irrigation is critical, because if you put a lot of water on the first irrigation, there's a greater tendency of moving down into the soil or moving off the soil by erosion. So if we can control that first water, whether it's if you're expecting a monsoon, you don't go out and put a pre-emergence herbicide on. Or if you have a choice for irrigation, you don't put on 6 or 9, 12 inches of irrigation water. You put on 1 to 2 inches. So you can control that to a great extent.
Is that true for Roundup also? Because they usually tell you to wait.
No, that has a different concern. Roundup in the sense of you do not want to get rain or water on it immediately, because it takes a little while to get into the plant. That's more concern. If you have 4 hours from application to irrigation, say, you've got 96% of the herbicide into the plant by that time. So if you get it to the soil, it's deactivated. It's not present. Yeah, it's a different type.
Temperature makes a difference on the day that you apply it.
Temperature will make a difference on the day you apply it. The temperature the day before may affect the herbicide activity. The temperature the day after may affect herbicide activity, particularly with post-emergence materials. Right. In fact, there are some that are even so selective that if you apply it in the morning versus the afternoon, there will be a difference in control. And these are things that are light activated. By putting a product on as it's becoming dark, you will have greater chance of moving the chemical in the plant, and therefore you have greater control than if you put it in high sunlight and it activates immediately, so that there's then little chance for it to move. Okay, these are the types. I've mentioned pre and post emergence several times. We've also talked about contact or systemic contact, killing only the photosynthetic area that you might hit. We've talked about selective and non-selective. There really is no truly non-selective herbicide. Roundup is not non-selective. We can use it around trees. There are certain plants like cheeseweed that's not very well controlled, so it's still somewhat selective. But that's basically the types of ways we would use a chemical.
What's an example of a post-emergent herbicide?
Glyphosate. Roundup would be post-emergence. Post, P-O-A-S-T.
Pre-emergent.
Pre-emergence, Treflan, Surflan, Betasan, Dacthal, Prodiamine, there's lots of them. Preen. Yeah, Preen is a trade name for Treflan, yes. There's actually one other, let me find this slide. There's one other slide I'd like to show you.
Can you explain this one while you're looking for it?
Expand on that? Yeah, that's the effect of a pre-emergent selective herbicide. Treflan on the right, actually alyssum and grass was planted through the whole flat. The right side was treated with trifluralin or Treflan, the left side was not. Now, we did not change the color of alyssum. That is not what the herbicide did, okay? All it did was it controls the grass and allows the alyssum to grow better.
What's the trade name for Treflan?
Preen. Preen. Yeah, Preen is one of the trade names. Actually, the safest products you can use are pre-emergents. And the reason is that the pre-emergence herbicide is basically made so that it affects germinating seedlings. And that's the weakest part of the total life cycle.
So the seeds are still there, so they can...
No, as they germinate, they're affected. If they don't germinate, they're not affected. But as they germinate, they're affected. Post-emergence materials usually tends to take a greater quantity, and if you spray late when the plants are larger, it's even going to take more chemical. So the best really way of looking at it is to try to look as almost as a preventive type treatment with a pre-emergent. But that means you have to know what plants you have too.
Okay, I thought that the pre-emergent just prevented the seeds from germinating.
No, they only affect the seedling as it's germinating. So as the root comes out of the seed or the radicle, it picks it up into the radical or in the root and takes it up into the top of the plant. So if the plant is dormant or seed is dormant or not germinating, it won't affect it at all. Get started again, let me just mention what's in your handout. I've tried to summarize some of the mulch work that has been done. All of this information is not something that I did myself, but there is a table in here that I think is somewhat interesting. That's table 1 on the second page. And what I've done here is to take different types of mulches to see if they're actually air or light permeable, not air, but light permeable. And I have a solar reading bar, if you will, which actually measures what's called PAR, which is photosynthetic active region of light. So what it does is that if that wave band of light is present or goes through the mulch, then you have a potential of germinating weeds. So what I did was to put different concentrations or depths of mulches or different types of mulches above this bar and measure the amount of light that goes through. One of those on the lower part under landscape fabrics was Typar. That's this one right here. And what happened was that Typar 2 ounces of spun bonded polypropylene had a light reading of 623, and as you can see, light does go through there. Now, sunlight at full noon, which is when we normally will measure it, as I remember, is about 1750 or 1800, so that kind of gives you an equivalent. So you're reducing roughly, what, by thirds, 2/3 of it, so you've got roughly 1/3 left, if you will, of light. So basically it means that this is a 2-ounce polypropylene resin. They also make a 3-ounce, which means they just spray more resin, but it allows less light. But if you really want total weed control with this, you have to put some sort of a plant-derived product over the top of it. So this alone would not allow weed control to be achieved. So that's what some of those figures are. The nice part is that the upper part looks at the amount of chips required, for example. So if you have 1 inch of very fine composted material, you get no light through. And that's plus. That's a real good, even at 1 inch. But that's quite fine. The problem is of trying to maintain 1 inch. That's why you tend to have to add more so that you can maintain, some level. The same would be true with 2 inches, mini chips, 1 or 2 inches, I got no light. So how do you control weeds in mulch? Because you have weeds in mulch, right? Why do you have weeds in mulch? The seed comes blowing in often, or you lose some of it. Some of it's degraded into organic material, and some of it gets pushed into the soil, so you begin to lose it. And if you get these wind-blown seeds, often you will have certain types of plants that will start growing. And I didn't go over some of these, but those of you who took the quiz, plant number 6, I'm sure most of you got it, has a wind-blown seed. Since it's very similar to dandelion, that's one of the common ones that would reinfest mulches. So which one was that? Number 6 right there. Absolutely. This woman got it right on the nail. Common groundsel. It's a winter annual. If you love horses, that poisons horses by chance. So it's really quite a poisonous weed. And people who like and have horses will not buy hay products that have that present, or otherwise the horses will become ill. Anyway, that is one of the common ones that will come in because the seed is actually blown in by wind. Yes?
How durable is
I'm sorry, this gentleman, then I'll get you. Yeah.
How durable is the fabric in sunlight?
That's a good question. How durable is this fabric in sunlight? Actually, this will probably last only about a year in full sun. The ultraviolet light will degrade this fairly readily, so you do need it to cover it again with a chip or something. There are others, however, which are not quite as sensitive. This is another, it's not spun bonded. This is what's called woven, and you can see the edge in the sense that it is a woven mulch. This is another polypropylene, but they put a UV or ultraviolet inhibitor in it, another chemical, and this has a guaranteed lifespan of at least 5 years in the open. And they have others that have a guaranteed lifespan of 10 years and more. So if you cover it in addition, then you're going to have a longer life even than that. This gentleman had a question.
If you have that common groundsel, can you say something about the disposal of it?
The disposal?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be kind of careful about getting rid of it so the seeds aren't going everywhere.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the question is, basically, how do you get rid of it so that you don't have a weed problem, I guess? Pull it before the seeds. Sorry, but yeah, if you can remove it actually before it flowers. This particular plant is a very interesting one also in the sense that if you pull it in full flower, there's enough nutrients, moisture left in that plant that it will actually produce a viable seed before it dries out. So if you can pull it when you start seeing a little yellow color, then that will not occur. But if it's in full flower, it will go ahead and produce a seed as it dries.
Compost?
Compost would not be a problem. Well, that's a simplistic answer. Not a problem. It's not a problem in the sense that you can use common groundsel seeding or not seeding in your compost pile. If you do not thoroughly compost it, however, to get the temperature required to kill the seed, you will spread the seed. So it needs to be turned and get your temperature up to a killing temperature. Otherwise, you will spread the seed. But under a good composting situation, it isn't a problem. Right? Yes.
What's the weed that has a very thick stem and then it's got a big taproot?
Let's see, I can start numbering about 100 of those. Yeah. Milk thistle is a good example of that. Can you give me some more description? What color flower?
Yellow flower.
Yellow flower. How tall does it get?
It gets 3-4 feet tall.
3 to 4 feet. Does it have a thistle type of flower, or is it a daisy type flower? Long petals, so long?
Oh, yeah, big petals.
Fairly, now sure it's not an ornamental you're trying to get me to. Well, one possibility. Do you know what sunflower looks like?
Yeah.
The ornamental sunflower, of course, is this huge, big flower head. There is a wild sunflower, often would have similar characteristics, except the flower itself can maybe be, the flower head may be that large, and it's becoming more common. I don't know if that's it, but it would be something similar maybe. I think there's a fellow over here.
I just want to know what happens to Typar. What does it break down to?
What does it break down to? That's a good question, and I can't totally answer that. It probably depends upon how it breaks down. It definitely eventually, yes, will go to carbon and hydrogen, but
Yes, but how do you arrange the carbon and hydrogen?
how do you arrange it?
Arranged? It could be
Well, it's going to be polypropylene for quite a while.
So it'll just be propylene It won't be poly, it'll just be propylene.
That's right, yeah, you'll end up with propylene, probably propylene fibers,
Yeah, which is okay.
which it's not going to bother anything, but it will be there for quite a while.
Right.
Yeah, but the same is true with polyethylene. You know, polyethylene will degrade in UV light eventually. If you put it in soil, however, the degradation is very, very slow. Yeah. Yes.
We get a weed that we call chicory, and I'm not sure that it is, with a blue flower on it.
Purplish to blue flower.
Yeah, and it's actually rather pretty, but I understand it's a signal that you have compacted soil.
The question was chicory. Yes, it's very likely that you do have chicory. It has a flower about 3/4 to an inch in diameter, and it has a purplish to light blue. Actually, the root is quite good with your coffee if you want to. It's actually an indicator of drouthy soils. It usually is found along roadsides or areas that's not cultivated. Or wastelands, if you will, where the soil at one time was disturbed, but then it's allowed to establish because it is a perennial, and if you cultivate it, you normally would kill it. So it's usually found as a roadside weed or a non-cropland weed rather than say a landscape weed. There are plants that are indicators of certain signs. I mentioned, of course, drought and wet areas. There are plants that love high nitrogen area. We mentioned the milk thistle is one, annual bluegrass is one, crabgrass, there's quite a number of them. And then there are also plants that love very, very low nitrogen areas, such as clovers. And as a fact, clovers do not grow well if there is high nitrogen, because they fix nitrogen themselves, and clover plants are really very lazy. You don't think of being an industrious or lazy plant, but clover plants will use any nitrogen available before they fix any. So if you want to make clovers grow well, you put in a lot of phosphorus in the soil and remove all nitrogen. So by growing a grass which loves nitrogen and doesn't really particularly care about phosphorus, grasses will use the nitrogen, and eventually as the nitrogen content goes down, the clovers come in as a weed. Yes?
Can I ask you about the allelopathy
Yes.
again? So when an average person calls about their house being built in an orchard, a destroyed orchard now,
Right.
and these trees have been pulled out, and they say certain trees were there before, and the orchard was burned, and now they can't get a certain type of plant to grow in their yard. Is allelopathy something that they would be thinking about, that the soil is somehow poisoned, and you said there are really very few plants that are able to do that?
Right.
So that actually is not really an issue?
Right. Did everybody hear what she's talking about? Or do I need to try to paraphrase it?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think that I would be concerned with anything that was growing there as far as allelopathy. There could be other concerns, however, depending upon how it had been handled the last few years. As an example, if it had been a commercial orchard that had been treated with herbicides, that could very much be a problem, because certain herbicides have enough residual in the soil that they may be there up to a year at least afterwards, depending upon how it was treated. Other herbicides, on the other hand, would have no residual, so we'd have to know how it was treated. If it was not a commercial orchard and they were not using herbicides, then there's a potential of other organisms, such as nematode in particular. If a person had been growing prune trees, for example, and tried to grow tomatoes and root knot nematode was present, you won't grow tomatoes or carrots, as an example. So there could be other organisms there that's left behind that would also suppress or affect secondary plant growth, whatever. So there would be, the herbicide aspect is something that any orchard situation that's been in commercial production for a period of time, someone really should look at that. It's not going to hurt you per se And if you plant certain plants in there, it's very unlikely that certain plants will grow depending upon the chemical that was used. And if you knew what chemical was there, you could plant something that would grow in it, but if you didn't know, you'd have to run what we call a bioassay, of just taking soil samples out of the area, plant certain vegetable plants in it, and watch them for 2 to 3 weeks and see what effect they have. Yeah, you had a question.
After a year, that effect should be gone
From the herbicide? The question was, am I saying that the herbicide effect would be gone after a year? It really depends upon what is used and how long it's been used.
Okay.
Right.
What would be the longest?
Well, the longest, well, the other thing it depends on also is how it was handled from the time the orchard came out until you're trying to plant in it. And basically what you're asking now has taken us, and I want others to note this, has taken us to a whole different level of knowledge required. And that's when you introduce pesticides, herbicides specifically into the system. And I'll tell you an example, which is an unfortunate example, but it happened on a university field station in Santa Clara. There was a pear orchard that had been there probably for 15 to 20 years. They pulled the orchard and they allowed a corn plant breeder, a genomics person out of Berkeley, to have that parcel of land right after the pears came out. And the corn got that tall and they got no ears whatsoever. This was 2 acres. And you know, it was absurd, but I was not asked to come in, or I could have told them, you will not plant corn for 2 years. You can plant fava beans, you can plant clover, you know, whatever, because I knew what herbicide that would have gone on there. But by knowing that, we could have made sure he did not get that corn in there. Fortunately, he had breeding stock in other locations, and it wasn't a total ruin of his program, but it ruined that site. But it really depends upon the chemicals used, how much it was used, how long it had been used, and then how you handle it. I mean, if you irrigate, have moist, warm conditions, the herbicide degrades very rapidly in general, and I'm generalizing here, by microorganisms in the soil. They actually use it as a food source. Yes?
Well, as a follow-up, is it likely that we would see anything like that for 5 to 20 years?
No.
Or is it's going to be limited to several years then?
That's correct. It actually tends to be quite a short period of time. Usually it's a year. If it's beyond that, then something extraordinary has happened. You know, I can create lots of horror stories, and that is a horror story. You know, it's something that hopefully if the person would talk to the right people, it should never have happened. However, I've been in this business for quite a long period of time, and when I first started as a graduate student, as an example, and some of you may gasp at this, but I was asked to use lead arsenate as an insecticide to sprinkle over potatoes for Colorado potato beetle, by hand, no gloves, no nothing. And look what it did to me. No, but over the years we have changed practices dramatically, and at one time the primary herbicide was sodium chlorate, sodium borate mixtures, and they were using 3,000 pounds per acre, which is salt. And that type of situation would have happened if they had used that type of a treatment. You will not be able to plant back in that for quite a long period of time. Plus, if you happen to have a cow grazing there, it would have killed her, because the salt would have killed cattle. Anyway, but that's all changed. We're very different now. Yes.
I was wondering, she said that she's able to get 2 plants to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Could the plants that are able to grow, could you use those to identify what's put in the soil?
Very likely, or if I could actually see the plants, probably the symptoms that that plant gave, I could tell you what it was, or at least put it in the family of chemistry. We can easily do that by...
You can take any field that might have this sort of a problem and say,
That's right.
Well, that's XYZ.
Yes, we can do that. In fact, yesterday in Salt Lake City, I gave a presentation on plant diagnostics with herbicides and trees. So, yes, I do that. And we can tell you what chemical family it's in and probably how much was there if we analyze for it and so on. Yeah. Anyway, the thing that we wanted to do is actually talk a little bit about solarization. I don't want to spend a lot of time on solarization, primarily because I think it has become sort of a known method, at least. And there is a publication. If you don't have it here in the office, it's I would assume that you would have. It's put out by the university. And it's a technique that I've worked with for quite a number of years. And it really is something that here in the valley we can use very well at certain times of the year for the reduction of not only weeds but also certain soil pathogens and nematodes. I mean, it's not complete, but and there are some sort of specific things that you have to do to make it work. It works primarily in the summertime in the valley because we need the radiation. We do need moisture in the soil before the clear plastic is put down. Clear is better than black. One would think that black plastic would absorb more heat. Well, the plastic does absorb more heat, but it doesn't allow it to get into the soil. By using clear plastic, long-wave radiation goes through the plastic, heats the soil without heating the plastic. So we use clear plastic. With moisture, basically prepare a seed bed, get something ready for planting. And during the period of, say, mid-May to 1st of June through the end of August, if we can get a 4-week period or 6-week period out of that area, then we can solarize and basically give you the type of weed control that's shown on the back. So for fall planted plants, whether they're transplants or direct seeded carrots or onions or broccoli, cole crops, anything of that sort, particularly fall seeded stuff, it is almost a perfect system. Now, it doesn't control everything. There are certain nematodes that it won't control, and there's actually some what's called thermophilic or heat-loving organisms that actually increase after the planting or after the treatment. Some of them are actually beneficial, some of them are detrimental. So it's not something that's going to be perfect. Field bindweed or perennial morning glory is not controlled well. We kill the seed pretty well, which is really a good thing because the bindweed seed will last 60 years. So by controlling the seed, we definitely do have a real advantage by using this because we can't do it with even fumigation. So it has a real advantage. You look like, what's the matter? Field bindweed, I don't know if you've ever seen the seed, it's extremely hard. You cannot get perennial morning glory, not the annual morning glory. Annual morning glory does not last that long. But the perennial form will last up to 60 years and still going. We don't know. So it keeps a weed scientist in business, right? You know, great job opportunities. But methyl bromide chloropicrin fumigation, which is a pre-plant and very harsh fumigation for biological organisms, literally germinates it. It makes it grow better because it's what's called scarifies the seed and allows moisture to get into the seed by having small cracks in the seed because of the scarification. So, and there are other seeds same way, clover seeds as well. Isn't it a wonderful world of plants, right? Anyway, solarization also gives us a sort of a crop boost, primarily because if you think about the organisms in the soil, if we're killing them, there's actually then a residual left from their being killed that plants can pick up. So we frequently find more available nitrate in the soil, a little bit more available ammonia in the soil, also magnesium and calcium are often in increased amounts after solarization. So we actually get a plant response from the solarization process in addition to weed control. So I think I'll actually quit there. We can't have shade on it. It doesn't work well in shade. If you plant on beds, run your beds north-south and not east-west. Does that make sense? Why? Great. You've got a sun going over that's uniform. So if you have a east-west bed, you've got a cold side and a warm side. If you have a north-south, you don't have a cold, warm side. One real advantage, say, is compared to Roundup, and that is that you don't have to worry about herbicide spray. It doesn't move. You know, solarization doesn't move, and if you get a little careless with it, it's not going to damage a desirable plant. It doesn't really affect roots. It doesn't kill earthworms. People say, well, it gets hot, kills earthworms. It doesn't. They're mobile. They move. They don't like it hot, so they move away from it. So it really has some real advantages. The only disadvantage, not only, there are more than one. One is it takes your ground out of production for a while. In the middle of summer when you want your tomatoes, you've got to move it around so that you can accommodate that if you want to use it. And the other is there's no good way of getting rid of the plastic. Now, in agriculture, that is being taken care of because, not in California, but they have now licensed a plant for recycling of plastic out of the field in Nevada. We have, again, my travels in the Middle East, Egypt has a recycling plant, Jordan has a recycling plant, Syria has a recycling plant, California can't get a recycling plant. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? We have regulated ourselves so much that by taking plastic out of the field, it becomes a toxic waste because of the soil that's left, and therefore they will not permit it in California. So the company buys it out of the field in California, takes it to Nevada, and rebuilds plastic from that old plastic.
Well, that's where the Trex goes.
That's what?
Trex. T-R-E-X.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a huge
That's right.
plant in Nevada.
That's it. At Lovelock. Fernley. Actually at Fernley.
Yeah.
Fernley, Nevada.
Fernley.
Right, Fernley. But anyway, that's sort of the story. We do have a potential of recycling the plastic we have in the field. Now, that doesn't help us in the home, of course. Are there questions on?
Does solarization kill Bermuda grass?
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. It's going to take longer than the 4 weeks in the summer. It can only be done in the summer in full sun. And best basically to mow it very closely and then don't have a lot of stubs that would go through the plastic. Get the soil quite wet and then pull plastic over it and walk away from it and let it heat. Keep your dog off of it. Don't let any deer go across it so that you don't want to puncture it. If it has little holes in it, fix it with 3M magic mending tape. Works beautifully. But black plastic will do the same thing. You have to leave it on longer. And it's different in that it's not solarizing to kill it. It's using it from lack of light to kill it. So you're starving it to death. So it takes longer. But black plastic will as well. There's another way to control Bermuda grass in the summer in Sacramento Valley, and that is we have the control of water. Dry it out. Just cut the water off. If you have an open area that you're wanting to put a garden, for example, and you want to control Bermuda grass, cut the water off and then cultivate it dry. It brings the stolons and rhizomes to the surface. Forget the roots, they're not going to regenerate anyway. Brings the stolon and rhizomes, which are stems, to the surface, dries them out, and you've controlled Bermuda grass.
The preceding program was part 2 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design, home vegetable gardening, and the wide variety of garden crops that are grown in the Golden State. The chapters in this handbook provide helpful information on selecting varieties, planting, growth cycles, pruning, irrigation, and harvesting. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu. cal.edu.